In this screencast, we'll look specifically at causes of water pollution, and we'll also take some extra time to talk about human wastewater, which is water produced from human activity, primarily concerning human sewage. So first, let's look at the definition of water pollution. Water pollution is a contamination of water bodies such as streams, rivers, lakes, ocean, or groundwater with substances produced by humans that negatively affect organisms, including human organisms. Now, we classify them as two types of sources, point source or non-point source. A point source is a distinct location that pumps waste into a waterway. And a non-point source is a diffuse area, such as an entire farming region or runoff from a parking lot that pollutes a waterway. Now, the reason these two classifications are important is that it is much easier to clean up a point source than a non-point source. Some type of filtration or anything could be, or just the length of a particular pipe can be used to make a point source less polluting. It can also, another advantage of a point source is that it's easier to monitor for water pollutants, known water pollutants that might be coming from that point source, and therefore detect a problem before it becomes a serious problem. An example of a non-point source would be the Neuse River that we talked about at the very beginning, the case study regarding the Neuse River, which had human developments, also had pig farming and had other agricultural farming, and those were non-point sources. All kinds of things were getting into the water, from fertilizer used on agricultural land to hog manure. So those are non-point sources and are more difficult to monitor and more difficult to clean up. Here's a lovely picture of a drainage pipe here showing you that this area could be monitored, and perhaps we could put some type of screening or other solution here to solve that. And this picture here on the right of these lovely grazing cattle would be non-point. And you see the river here. That one actually looks like a very slow-moving river, but the more fast it would move, perhaps the more it could carry the waste away. Oops. Okay, now we're going to look at human wastewater. And this is also part of your open response and is a very important concept to understand. So we'll start with the definition. Wastewater is any water produced by human activities. These human activities include having human sewage from toilets enter the water, and gray water from bathing or washing clothes or dishes entering the water, and therefore introducing contaminants. And it can be a problem anywhere in the world. It's particularly problematic in developing countries where people may be washing their clothes, for example, in the same water that is used for bathing and the same water that is used to dispose of waste. And it's a problem because human sewage may contain certain bacteria, for example, that make people sick. So if one person has that bacteria in their waste and that gets into the water, and then someone else drinks it or washes their clothes with it, then they too get the bacteria and get sick. So now we'll look at the process that happens when human wastewater enters a water body, and just a few terms, and then we'll talk about sort of the spiraling up, the positive feedback loop that occurs. So first, the definition of oxygen-demanding waste. Oxygen-demanding waste is organic waste. Remember that organic means has a lot of carbons bound to carbon in it, which human sewage does, and that feeds bacteria that use oxygen in the water. At the same time, you have nutrients being released from decomposing wastewater, so this organic waste also feed bacteria, but also add nitrogen, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus, into the water body. So the process as it occurs is called cultural eutrophication. And here's the cycle. It begins with an algal bloom. So the waste gets into the water. The waste begins to break down. And as it breaks down, there is more nitrogen and phosphorus in that water body. And that nitrogen or phosphorus are limiting nutrients normally for algae. And so once they have all of these nutrients in the water, there's an algal bloom, which means they reproduce at a high rate, and there's a whole bunch of them. Now, algae use oxygen for their respiration processes. And so as they do, since there are so many of them, the bloom of algae then decreases oxygen content of the water. You don't need to know this term, but it is in your textbook. Biological oxygen demand of the algae decreases the oxygen content of the water. So this actually, the oxygen then gets too low, and algae need a certain amount of oxygen to thrive. So then they begin to die, and bacteria then feed on the algae. The bacteria also use oxygen, but they can do with far less, and there are even some bacteria that don't need oxygen. So, but basically, they need far less oxygen than the algae do. But then there's a whole bunch of nutrients for them, the algae, and so they start feeding on the algae, and that also furthers the amount of organic material, the nutrients in that water. Ultimately, what happens is dead zones result. That means the amount of oxygen available in the water is too low for fish, including shellfish, to survive, and so then the fish die. And they also further contribute to this nutrient load that's happening in that body of water. So you can see the whole cycle is a very negative one. So let me just run through that again in order. The process of adding nutrients to the water is called cultural eutrophication. Remember, eutrophication means making the water more productive, and that's not a positive or negative. It just means there's more biological matter in the water. It begins, it's first detected when there's enough eutrophication there that it results in an algal bloom. The algae use up a lot of the oxygen content because they have a high biological oxygen demand. They decrease the amount of oxygen available in that water body. And then it gets so low they can't survive. So then bacteria begin to feed on the dead algae. Bacteria can live at a lower oxygen content, but as they feed on the algae, they're only making the amount of nutrients, the nutrient load of that body of water higher and higher. And ultimately, the water has so little oxygen that dead zones are created because fish and other aquatic life and aquatic plants, as a matter of fact, can't survive at these low oxygen levels. So a second concern is that human wastewater can carry a wide variety of waterborne disease-causing organisms. A disease-causing organism is called a pathogenic organism. And there are many diseases which you may have heard of over time: cholera, typhoid fever, many serious diarrheal illnesses, and hepatitis are caused by bacteria and viruses that are present in one person's body, and through the wastewater contamination of the water is carried to someone else's body. Now, here in the United States, we look at indicators of wastewater contamination. The most widely used bacteria is E. coli. It's naturally present in our intestines, and most strains do not cause a serious illness, but it does indicate that some fecal matter has entered the water body. There are now actually further tests where your water department can determine whether the particular source is human wastewater or whether it's from living things such as deer. And that makes a big difference, because if the deer is contaminating the water, it's not going to make the humans sick, most likely, that we would continue to monitor that. But human wastewater indicators would indicate that we should not, that the water cannot be drank or even bathed in. And that's when you get your boil water orders. So this is considered such a serious situation that the EPA has set the maximum contaminant level for E. coli at 0 for drinking water. They don't want to have any E. coli present, though in reality, if you have one positive test per month, it's considered okay, understanding that they test over and over again, multitude of times each month. Okay, and the recommended level for fishing and shellfishing, I believe, is about 12. And swimming also has another level. I think it's about 100, as I recall. So anyway, so let's move on from there. So we don't have just human wastewater, as we mentioned. Getting in livestock is also a huge contributor to the water being contaminated. And so we have various systems that are used for humans and systems that are used for livestock to clean or receive the wastewater and clear it up before it enters a general body of water or the aquifer. So the first one is a septic system, and that's used widely in rural areas. It's the main system that is used on the Cape for human sewage, though we have more and more centralized plants now, but as our population and our density increases. So you have a home, and it has a pipe coming out from the home, and it has all of the water, the gray water from washing clothes and taking showers, and toilet water. And they come out through one pipe all together and go enter this tank called a septic tank. And as it sits in the septic tank over a period of time, the heavier waste material sinks to the bottom because it's heavier than the water, and that's called the sludge. And then the top layer, there's a layer called the scum layer, and then in between is the septage. And the septage is a liquid which will contain some nutrients that have been broken down. The septage, you can see, comes out right about here. So we don't want to get the scum layer on the top. You don't want the sludge going from the bottom here. This liquid level, the septage, then flows through the leaching field. And in the leaching field are a series of perforated pipes through which small quantities of water are introduced into the soil. And the soil then cleans, bacteria and other organisms in the soil essentially clean the septage by taking up the nitrogen and phosphorus and other things, so that as you move beyond the area of the leach field, the water, or below the area of the leach field, the water is not contaminating either your aquifer or any other water body, like a pond that might be near your house, for example. So that is effective as long as the septic system is big enough and the density of the population is not so high, and the distance to the aquifer or your distance to a pond is not much at all. Okay, last thing on septic systems, and then I'll have to continue with this on another screencast, but that's why you need to get your septic system pumped to remove the sludge material. That is then taken somewhere, typically a landfill, to be processed. So it goes somewhere. It doesn't disappear. That's the issue with all of our pollutants. All right, I'll move on to another screencast.